I wanted to mention that today we have like only kind of 5 minutes of prepared material, and we're mostly hoping for open discussion, and we have some like topics for discussion to kind of spur discussion. But so just keep that in mind. I'm trying to solicit feedback wherever you want, so, or it's easiest for people. So we threw up this Slido, I don't know how it's pronounced, but that is an option for people in addition to the chat. And with that said, I wanted to, there's a chat. Where did it go? Where's my chat? Okay, I don't know how to, I'm sorry. All right. Well, if you're chatting me, I can't, oh, there it is.
It gets confusing whenever you go to present mode, the whole interface changes. And so a little surprising.
Yeah, oddly, it was putting the chat behind the other controls, so I couldn't even see it. Okay, so if you, I'm gonna start by doing an experiment and seeing if we can do like a show of hands kind of thing. So I think what's easiest for me now in this mode here, yeah, is if we do like, if you open up the participants tab and click raise hand. So first off, who can find the raise hand button? So I get a denominator. Okay, thank you. Fair enough, these are all, oh, Joey gave me a check mark. But okay, so you are all AMP contributors. You can lower your hands now, click the button again. In that case, the raise hand might not be too useful because I know all of you and you're all AMP contributors. But if you, I'll do one more just in case. So who wants to have a kind of refresher on sign exchanges and how AMP uses them? Cool. Okay, that's enough for me. So we'll start with that, and then we'll move into another piece of prepared material, which is like the updates we've done on the help in the ease deployment. And then we'll go open. So to start off, let me try and switch tabs. Aha. So to start off, we have this slide. So this is a slide I stole from our presentation last year. This was in combination with Matt Mower, who's a AMP contributor both to the AMP project and AMP packager. And he mentioned that it was kind of his favorite slide, and I've come to agree, because it is the most kind of direct answer to what is a sign exchange. Is this blob of gobbledygook here. So just walking through it a little bit, at the bottom you see HTML. And in just in front of the HTML, you see some like Unicode question marks and stuff. That's the integrity markers for the HTML. Let me try and pull it. Where did chat go? Chat keeps hiding itself. Ah, okay. Cool. The above the so that's the integrity stuff that it means enables signed exchanges to be kind of tamper-proof. In front of that is all the HTTP headers that you would normally get on HTTP, all the response headers. And then in front of that, there's a few different things. We'll start with the very top, which is SXG1-B3 that says it's a sign exchange. Then what follows is the URL that the sign exchange actually represents. And then what follows is this sig equals base 64 encoded gobbledygook. So that's the actual signature itself. And that is the thing that signs basically the rest of this file. And it says, so then the browser can use this signature to verify that the rest of the file matches. And the way it validates the signature is if you look a little bit lower down on the third line, it says cert URL equals blah, blah, blah. The browser fetches the cert and uses that to validate the signature. So that cert has to match that URL, the wompamp.cmviz.com. So it uses all the typical kind of PKI infrastructure there. So that's what a sign exchange is, going really to the technical part, but let's jump back to like the front and say what it does. So this magical transformation there, it fixes the URL to match what was actually specified in the sign exchange, and gets rid of the typical like little we call it a butter bar internally, the little the AMP viewer origin bar there, since it can now be expressed in the URL. So we kind of covered all that. You can kind of think of it as an additional layers, because the sign exchange itself is still sent over top of HTTPS, but it introduces like an additional layer of like pseudo HTTPS from the signed origin. Another thing to mention is that like these sign exchanges, when publishers sign them, they're really only meant for crawlers, and they should continue to serve HTML to users, because it's when it's coming from the origin, it's faster that way, because it just introduces a little bit of decoding time. But it's super helpful for the kind of prefetching thing. Yes, sign exchanges. So the other thing to mention now is that there's two ways to deliver sign exchanges, to create sign exchanges. One is using Cloudflare is built. So if you use Cloudflare as a CDN, you can go to their settings page and click a checkbox. And within, I don't know how long, but within a little bit, it just magically works. If you want to DIY, you can go check out the AMP packager using like the Go compiler, build it yourself and configure it and launch it on a server. And so the second approach is what we're going to be talking about today, because that has been always difficult. And so what we kind of see is that the first approach is what kind of the so-called tail of the web uses, the mom and pops and most people who account for like the range of diversity of the web. But the second approach, it has been currently more limited to the sort of the head of the distribution, the more major sites that have can invest in building this out. So we'd like to sort of bridge that gap and get that middle of the distribution. And so yeah, that said, I'll exit this presentation. Go back to this. So just in case, I will open the floor for a few seconds in case there are any participants that joined since we started or have been hiding out. Anyone using AMP packager or AMP sign exchanges through Cloudflare, or isn't but is interested and kind of wants to talk about their blockers? Okay. We'll move forward then. This may be a short preso, guys. Folks, I should say. And I will go ahead and talk about our next step. So obviously, like compiling a server and throwing it and like SSHing into your Docker instance or whatever and installing it, that's not going to work. So we're looking on how to improve that. And so there are kind of two factors we want to factor in here. One is, we've got limited resources ourselves to kind of invest in how to help people. So we're looking for how can we get the most bang for the buck. And so Docker seems like a reasonable place to do that, because it is the basis for a lot of different deployments out there. The second factor we want to consider is that AMP packager functions by using a private key of your TLS certificate. So it's a a TLS signed exchange certificate. It's not your main TLS certificate, but it's still important and still pretty powerful. So we want to, certain things are kind of out of the picture as a result of that, where we don't want like it to live in a shared process with other users, for instance. So some security constraints there. That said, I want to hand it off to Alan to kind of talk about our work to simplify the Docker world of things. I don't need to click it because I already have it open here. Go ahead.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Banag, and I'm a software engineer for the AMP team, working on sign exchanges. Devin and I are working to make sign exchange deployment experience a little bit better, and this is one of the aspects of that, having an AMP packager reference implementation on Google Cloud. Next slide. So what does AMP packager on Google Cloud mean? As Devin had mentioned, this means that the AMP packager will be a self-contained Docker container. We already have an example of this sort of in development mode. We have a self-signed certificate mode for AMP packager deployed as a Docker container. We want to kind of extend that, that deployment into a more production environment where we could actually use real certificates. The AMP packager also needs several inputs for it to be installed on Google Cloud. So things like your Google Cloud account information, your DigiCert account information for renewing your sign exchange certificates, and your domain setup. They all need to be collected before the deployment happens. So the script takes care of doing this. And of course, the installation script will bring up the AMP packager as a Kubernetes app in Google Cloud once you've satisfied all the requirements. Once it's up, there will be a renewer instance of AMP packager that takes care of renewing sign exchange certificates automatically through Acme. And this is why you need the DigiCert account information. And then you have 2 or more consumers that are responsible for the packaging aspect of the deployment. And those could be scaled up depending on how you configure your cluster. Next slide, please. All the deployment instructions in full detail can be found in GitHub. It's in the master tree right now. It's fairly well detailed, but if you look at it in a nutshell, what it really means is it's in the next slide. You need to set up your G-Cloud account with the necessary information. You install needed cloud tools to actually get the deployment script running, and then you edit the setup script with all the information that you need for the deployment. Once that's set, you can actually run gcloudup.sh, which is a shell script that actually runs the full gamut of instructions to actually get the deployment ready. And this is just a combination of Google Cloud SDKs and Kube CTL commands and Docker commands to actually get everything up and running. Once it's up and running, you could inspect and test the results, and then eventually wire it up to your front end when everything is done. Next slide, please. So the architecture is pretty simple. Everything is running under a Kubernetes cluster inside your Kubernetes engine. There's an AMP packager Kubernetes application that consists of a load balancer. The load balancer basically provides an externally accessible IP address that sends traffic to the correct port on all your cluster nodes, which is basically your consumer nodes. And the external load balancer will apply logic that ensures the optimal distribution of requests to your AMP packagers. One other thing of note is that the consumers and the renewers share an NFS service that basically takes care of handling all the configuration files and your certificates and your caches, like your OCSP cache, for certificate renewals. Next slide, please. Once everything is up, you could see it using the Google Cloud Console. As you can see here, there's the AMP packager cluster running on a particular zone that you configured in the setup step of your installation. You can also have a cluster size, also configurable through setup. Next slide, please. The service, you can see the AMP packager service, which is your load balancer with an externally available IP address. And of course, your NFS server, where all the configuration and the certificates actually get stored. We made it into an NFS server, so sysops could actually extract the certificates that get retrieved by from DigiCert without any troubles. It's a little bit more easier to manage. Next slide, please. And finally, the deployment. You have your NFS server deployment and the renewer deployment, the single renewer deployment with 2 consumer deployments, as we have as the installation defaults to. You could do a lot more stuff inside Google Cloud Console to actually look at the configurations of this, but I'm not going to go through that. That could be left as an exercise for you guys when you play around with the installation. Next slide, please. Of course, having a shell script is great, but it's not. Some companies don't necessarily have technical team or the skill set to actually run a script. So what we want to do as a next step is actually go even further and put the AMP packager in as a self-contained deployer in Google Cloud Marketplace, and we're working towards that goal right now. What that would mean is it will be available as a self-contained installation package, which prompts you with a UI, and you enter all the information that you need, and it actually does all the work magically in the background, and it installs everything into the cloud without much intervention from the users. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we'd love for you to help us. We actually put together an integration survey for what, and the links are on the screen as to what might be our next steps to pursue, what kind of environments you guys are running. So it will give us an idea of what we could pursue as a priority for AMP Packager as our next steps. And lastly, there's a web packaging announce group. Also, the Google Groups link is also on the screen, where we would announce future projects related to AMP Packager and packaging in general. And with that, I turn it over to Devin to talk, and he's gonna lead a breakout session for discussing more of these ideas. Thanks.
Hello. I should learn to unmute myself quickly. Thank you, Alan. That was really great, and I'm looking forward to that Google Marketplace click to deploy thing. I think that'll be big. Moving forward, we kind of wanted to throw a bunch of ideas against the wall and see what sticks. And so if anyone has any, well, let me block off that bottom part. We don't talk about it just yet. But anyone has any thoughts about these, feel free to chime in. Docker is kind of like the generic way, and then you're still, at that point, you are left to kind of wire it up to your CDN and do some amount of configuration there, and we can help with documentation. But it's possible, it might be possible to go one step further than that even, and make it directly integrated into various products out there, just as Cloudflare has done. And so this is just kind of throwing a bunch of these things against the wall. It could become an nginx module or an Apache, mod SXG. It could be a plug-in to some of the CDN's kind of edge capabilities, or a plug-in to CMSs. So we're curious to see what things people would find appealing, or what they're using, and where it would make sense. And we're kind of, we obviously don't have the staffing to work on all of these things. So we're trying to figure out how to prioritize that. The other thing I wanted to mention, or to call out, I guess, from Alan's presentation is one he kind of mentioned the concept of the renewer and the consumer. One of the things that was added since last year's presentation on AMP Packager was Acme support, and this is still kind of rolling out. We haven't kind of officially released AMP Packager version 3, but you can see it in the master branch. So Acme is allows for automated cert renewal. It's a RFC 8555, I think. And so once you set up your in this case your DigiCert credentials, that kind of the renewal of the cert every 90 days will happen automatically by that computer. So that's great. And that functionality exists whether or not you use the Docker deployment, but the Docker deployment makes it easier for sure. Do we have any thoughts or questions on that before I move on to the next subject? Okay. I will talk a little bit about future stuff then. Next up is non-AMP signed exchanges. So this is something we're very interested in. And as Malta mentioned during the kind of TSC Q&A, news is imminent. But one of the nice things about signed exchanges is that they allow us to do the instant prefetching, instant page loading, however you want to call it, privacy preserving page loading in a way that doesn't require application layer details, sort of. You know, you don't have to, AMP sets a whole lot of constraints at the HTML layer in order to sort of guarantee privacy and to guarantee that we can make certain rewrites, like URL rewrites, without having that we can make those changes without breaking the page. But for arbitrary HTML, we can't do that because, you know, there's arbitrary JavaScript running on the page or who knows what else, and so it would be, we'd have to solve the halting problem in order to actually guarantee that that was safe. So sign exchanges live at the kind of the HTTP layer, and they kind of, you can think of them as like a kind of a caching layer, almost like they're an HTTP cache. And most web pages out there have learned to live with an HTTP cache and coexist perfectly with them. So this makes it very easy to deploy for kind of arbitrary web content. The story on kind of how they're useful, especially in the context of like coming from an aggregator like Google Search, is kind of different, because they kind of serve the function of meeting in the middle between AMP and non-AMP. So an AMP, Google and Bing and a few others have developed, embed the kind of instant prefetch of AMP. They make it fast, but the URLs are not great, as we've seen. So for AMP, sign exchanges fix the URLs, and along with it, the cookies and all that. Whereas for non-AMP, they bridge the gap in the other direction, whereas cookies and everything were working, and URLs were working, and seamlessly between cache and origin. And sign exchanges allow them to be prefetched. So as I say here, for the instant prefetch, not fixing URLs. I can go along with that, kind of show two uses. You can stop this slide. That have to do with that. These are a couple of things. One is a Go binary, where it's very similar to Go binary rather, very similar to AMP packager, but for general HTML content, and can be applied, can be run as a CLI or to like generate it offline, or as a web server just as AMP packager. And the other is an nginx module to generate sign exchanges, and that, once you compile into nginx, it kind of just runs in process. And both of these are not AMP oriented, but but yeah, can work for non-AMP. Sorry. Those are a couple, and also perhaps worth mentioning is that this one is based on a C library, libxxg. So if you have other uses for generating sign exchanges, and you want to do some coding, you can import this and hook it up to your favorite language. Questions and thoughts on that? Okay. Lastly, then I'll just kind of move on to a couple of different far future explorations. And these are not going to happen within a year, I don't think, but I would say conservatively, I tend to estimate conservatively, like 2 years plus, I think, before these become a thing. So we don't have to worry about like having to do any kind of code churn on our end. And as much as possible, we would change AMP Packager and Web Packager to support these standards going forward. So as sign exchanges get integrated into the IETF WPAC group, some kind of new versions of the standard are going to come out. One of them is bundles, and you've probably heard of this because bundles are kind of useful in a lot of different ways. People are exploring bundles as an alternative to, or in addition to, Webpack and Rollup and these kind of things for grouping your JavaScript. If those of you who saw the minimum viable chunk presentation saw the sort of trade-off space between making making lots of chunks and having great cache hit ratio, but then your compression ratio is really bad because you can't do compression between multiple resources. So bundles actually kind of solve that trade-off. Or possibly. I guess sort of the IETF discussion for that is ongoing, but it seems promising. So that's one thing that sign exchanges could turn into, and that could allow them to represent not just the HTML page, but also its sub-resources. Another thing is a proposed alternative from Mozilla folks to the signed portion of it, actually. So to kind of fix the URL and the origin through a kind of a ping, an ACK sent to the origin server, and get their sort of approval to sort of change the origin. And this would allow instant navigation, but with like temporarily with the incorrect URL as it kind of gets that approval from the origin to get the correct URL. So that's exciting. That's pretty new as well, and there's also discussions involved to make that work, because that happens a little bit more at the application layer, at the HTML layer than HTTP, so it's not seamless. And lastly, you heard Malta talk about portals as well, and that could be a long-term thing that we see that proves fruitful. In particular, as you mentioned, also portals look like they're gaining steam in the same origin department first, but there is interest in cross origin for things like payment processors. I don't know a lot of detail about that, but that could be useful in the long term too. That's kind of all I wanted to talk about. Any thoughts? Well, in that case, we can end basically on time. I just encourage everyone again to take that survey, and I'll present that survey URL once more: bit.ly/amp-integration-survey. And to please join that. And if you are a user or interested in becoming a user of any of these tools, join that announcements mailing list, and that will be our way of communicating. In addition, the announcement type of things, and, we're obviously open for feedback on GitHub and Slack and so on. But this will be the best way we can make kind of the broad reaching announcements. Thank you.